present his topic, Halal, a platform for social integration.
Very much for that introduction. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here this morning and to speak to such a distinguished audience. I have quite a few things today to speak to you about, but before I begin to speak about them, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Huda. I run a company called Unitas Communications. Next. And we are, there you are. So we are a communications and research consultancy based in the UK. We offer media comms and political consultancy services. We work with a range of different clients in the UK, including the United Nations, the Arab League, the National Health Service, and those like organisations. Today I'm going to speak to you about some of my thoughts on Halal as a platform for integration, but also we're going to touch upon some of the challenges and issues that Halal industry faces in Europe from our perspective, and hopefully, inshallah, there will be something that everybody here will be able to take away from the presentation. So, if we look at some of the perception challenges facing the halal industry in Europe, here are some of the issues that my team came up with. Halal meat is regularly associated with having cruelty in the press. We have an issue with newly introduced EU legislation which will create negative reaction from EU consumers. There are issues around, everything to do with Sharia compliance being perceived negatively in the Western press, and that is primarily due to this kind of meta-narrative that Muslims are trying to force their way of life upon people in the West. There's also a confusing definition of halal amongst both Muslims and non-Muslims, and this is a major issue we find within the industry. And often, of course, halal products are perceived to be of poor quality. And these are some of the primary perception challenges that we believe the halal industry faces in Europe as a whole. I'm going to just share with you some examples of the media coverage that we picked up on. I'm sure you're aware of it. I don't want everybody to be completely depressed this morning, but we had a story recently in the Daily Mail about halal Britain schools and institutions serving up ritually slaughtered meat. Now, the issue here, of course, is that the way the article was framed is that there are growing fears amongst the public that we are unwittingly supporting a cruel form of butchery. Many issues here, and the Daily Mail have been particularly vociferous about this. You have an issue here about how a particular prison was serving halal meat to its inmates, even though there were only 7 Muslims that were in the prison in total. And of course, the insinuation here is that halal meat is so bad it's not even suitable for prisoners. Then, of course, we had an article recently there was a huge furore about Harrow Council. Harrow Council made a decision to introduce halal meat generally into its sort of food chain with respect to council food and schools and that sort of thing. And there was a sort of backlash about that. Now, when we look at some of these issues and we look at some of the reasons why these issues have arisen, here are my thoughts on some of the challenges that are facing the halal industry. That's not me. Okay. Now, we have, for instance, there is no European-wide industry body. There is little or no coordinated EU governmental engagement strategy amongst the halal industry. There is little or no understanding of why PR is important to Muslim and non-Muslim audiences. We can't just assume that we should take some of our audiences for granted here. Also, there is a lack of understanding of how negative external factors affect the industry. And there's also no established, well, I know there are moves towards it, but there are no established international halal standard or measurable standards of professional conduct within the industry, i.e. chartership and that sort of thing. And of course, there's generally perceived to be poor advertising and marketing around the industry. These are some of the challenges we feel that are facing the halal industry in Europe. Now, just to talk a little bit about how public relations can help sell halal to wider audiences. we've got to begin to associate halal values with universal ethical values. As we know, some of the values that underpin halal as we understand it are universal values, and it's about insinuating that conversation within the marketing material that we present. As Muslims, we know that this is a fundamental part of why we want to go halal in various products anyway, but it's about convincing the wider audience, and not enough of that is being done. Now, here are some thoughts that I have on how we might be able to deploy this. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, promoting values of halal is as important as promoting halal produce itself. I think this is an important argument that we need to understand. Also, enhancing the presentation and adab associated with halal is vital to attracting non-Muslim consumers. There is halal needs to be more than just the way you slaughter the meat. It needs to be about how you present it, how you conduct your business, your ethical standards, and that sort of thing. And it's a movement that needs to be presented as such. Also, it's important that we promote the values associated with a global halal standard once we have that created. And I think it's also important to enlist and incentivize ordinary Muslims to market halal values and goods, in the sense that the ordinary Muslim consumer needs to become somebody who promotes halal on a one-to-one level to their friends and their family, and is able to convince them. At this stage, I don't think the industry has inspired enough Muslims to go out and promote it in the West. And I think if we can reach a point where ordinary Muslims are able to become evangelists for halal, the industry will grow quite a bit. Now, I want to look at a case study of how PR and press might be able to solve some of the problems that we're facing. So, for instance, we have this issue, and I know that there are sessions on this later on, about how the EU wishes to label halal produce as unstamped in supermarkets. The problem we have with this issue is that this will cause a backlash amongst consumers who fare unstamped meat and will view it as uncivilized. Now, of course, I mean, the sort of conventional thinking is that this will now go through, where it's too late to do something about it. But let's look at some of the things we could have done. We could have had a targeted public affairs campaign, deploying Muslim political influence across Europe to bring pressure onto MEPs. One of the great untold stories that we have in Europe is the rise in Muslim political influence. I'm sure you all know we have a serving Muslim cabinet minister. We also have a serving shadow Muslim cabinet minister in the UK. The leader of the Green Party in Germany is a Muslim. We have the mayor of Rotterdam in Holland is a Muslim. We have a cabinet minister in France is a Muslim. There is the Muslim demographic in Britain is growing in its political influence. And it's important that when we talk about halal, we leverage some of the existing political capital that we have already. Also, I think it's important to engage the animal rights lobby. They're not going to go away. And by engaging them and tackling their arguments head-on, we're able to make a difference. I know that there are some people who actually argue that, for instance, the issue of stunning, it's a debate on whether it's more humane or not, and we should be confident in putting those arguments forward. I also think that it might be interesting to create a policy network among senior civil servants across Europe who deal with the halal issue. For instance, we have here DEFRA in Britain, which is the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Of course, there are equivalents of these sort of departments across Europe. Has anybody created a policy network among civil servants to talk about these things, so that when an issue of halal comes up at the EU level, we're able to draw upon the collective experience of a policy network and actually deploy that in Brussels as and when we need it. Next. Also, I think a targeted media campaign explaining the halal meat issue to columnists, journalists and TV hosts across Europe would have been vital. I mean, of course, in some cases that's a no-brainer, but it takes a lot of work to actually, I do this day in, day out for various clients across Europe, so it takes a lot of work to actually prep a journalist, go and see somebody, get them speaking on site. It's not impossible, but nobody's even coherently putting that case forward for the halal industry in Europe. And we need to begin to do that if we're going to want people to take our industry seriously. I work across Europe on a number of issues to do with Muslim media perceptions, and one of the projects I worked on was a UN project recently looking at this. And the meta-narrative is huge and vast, and the more individuals we have engaging and countering it, the better it will be for an industry as a whole. We cannot disassociate, the halal industry cannot disassociate itself from the meta-narrative about Muslims that we have in Europe at the moment. Also, I think it might be interesting to have a social media campaign that targets young Muslims. The vast majority of Muslims in Europe, I can't remember the stats offhand, in fact it might be on my notes there, but I can't see them. 70% I think are under the age of about 27 or 25, and you know, they engage in social media, they're on Facebook, they're on Twitter, and any industry that is able to tap into that young demographic is sort of guaranteed not just commercial but political clout. And it's important that we engage and understand ways of doing that, and I think the halal industry needs to begin to be ahead of the curve and begin to do that. I mean, can you imagine if you had 100,000 people who like halal meat on Facebook? That is saying something to not just to the industry, but to politicians who wouldn't dare legislate against something that is conventionally popular. I think it's important, I mean, again, some of this stuff is happening, and I don't mean any disrespect to people who are already involved in it, but it's important to build sustained interfaith alliances to lobby at the EU level. I mean, I know that there are attempts to form pan-European Muslim organisations. In fact, I sit on the board of one myself, but we don't have enough, and we need more to do that. And we also need to work more closely with the Jewish community than we are now. I think that they are, in many respects, in a similar boat to us, and there are many ways that we can engage with them. Also, I think another thing we should have been doing is showcasing halal organic farms. There are halal organic practices. There is a positive story to tell. There is a story to tell about how Islam encouraged individuals to go and set up a farm that did good things and that had halal produce because they chose to make this a way of life, and the environmental issues that they considered, the way they treated the animal, the care that went into it. Nobody's telling that positive story, and I think it's important that we begin to tell it. Now that's what we should have done, but now maybe some things that we can do. Next. Right, so I think that moving forward, here are some suggestions that I suggest we may want to consider taking up. I think it's important to create an industry network that promotes the interests of halal producers across Europe. That's